we've heard a lot about Afghanistan already this morning, and you're kind of uniquely positioned to tell us, give us some insights because of your media empire there. One of the things that I know is on people's minds that more than half of Afghanistan is under the age of 21, which means that they've never lived under the Taliban. They're accustomed to modern freedoms in the cities. Just wondering how you think they're going to respond to the new restrictions under everything that's happened in the last month.
Well, I mean, they've taken a stand on a number of issues, including women's rights. We've had protests almost every day over the last week or so. There were anti-Pakistan protests 2 days ago. So it's interesting that many were unwilling to get out and do the same during the Ghani administration, but they're coming out now because I think they realize what's at stake. My concern is that the Taliban, who to an extent, well, up until yesterday, they had no cabinet, no government. My concern is that they will snap because the default mode of the Taliban is to be dictatorial, to not tolerate any sort of dissent or criticism. So while we're covering events on a day-to-day basis, we're also trying to engage the Taliban and trying to, make them understand that this is in their interest, to allow people to express themselves, to allow them to protest, to allow them to come on television and talk about these issues. Some understand this, but my concern is that the vast majority of the Taliban leadership will be intolerant, will actually not stand for this sort of environment.
And they've gotten very social media savvy, the Taliban has. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think that that's going to affect what they allow in Pakistan? Will they change what's accessible on the internet, or how will that work?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to remember that they have yet to take over the major institutions. I mean, they've had some people say the intelligence agency or the police, but now they're in charge, and there's absolutely little doubt that they will have the right softwares and that they will have the right technical people, Afghan, Pakistani, or others. They'll bring in the experts. Even in the old days, we had reports that at a sort of like, for example, in a district in, say, Helmand, that they would use sort of low-end software to monitor what people were doing. And even at checkpoints, the guy who basically had sort of a grade 1 education could look through an iPhone and find the right apps and find where the photos are, the videos. They could find pretty much what they were looking for. So they understood enough to, they understood what to look for. And I think they're going to become a lot more sophisticated. And if we do see a regime that's got its back against the wall, it's cornered, the country facing a major economic and humanitarian crises, I think that they will snap. And I think that, we could see into sort of a North Korea or a Khmer Rouge rather than sort of the Taliban, Taliban 2.0, which they've been pushing very hard internationally, that, they're much more progressive and much more open. So I think that's our concern, that you will see them default into that sort of the Taliban 1.0 mode fairly quickly.
Yeah, and what other differences, that's a great way of putting it, what other differences are there between the Taliban 1.0 and 2.0 in your view, since you've seen it evolve over the last 20 years?
Right now, there are a lot of differences, but this is the problem, is that there are no guarantees that the situation will remain as is today. For example, they're allowing women to go to schools, they're allowing women to go to universities, albeit they're separated. We're seeing segregation at universities, but it's better than nothing. We're seeing, television was banned during the Taliban era. There are dozens of TV stations. They're tolerating people like us discussing the daily protests, discussing the fighting in Panjshir. We have critics live on Skype from Copenhagen or Dubai or whatever. They seem to be more tolerant of these sorts of things. They're allowing female doctors. They're allowing clinics to remain open. So these are positive changes. The question is, will they just leave things alone? And my concern is that they will not, that they will become more restrictive.
Sorry.
I think you're
yeah, thank you. Just to move back to questions relating to kind of American public opinion, were a lot of people on the ground there surprised that public polling indicated that Americans supported this hasty Afghan exit? Did that come as a surprise, do you think, to people on the ground?
I think when the Americans announced that they will leave, Afghans stopped caring what the Americans thought. We're survivors. We just move on. Even someone like me, I can't be bothered talking about the decision and what's transpired since. And obviously, it's been a badly executed plan. And I'm sure that Ambassador Crocker and others, Mike McKinley and others, probably discussed it before I joined your forum. But Afghans don't care. It's about the future now that we're concerned about.
Okay, great. And so what do they think the future holds then?
Well, we don't know. And I think, the fact that people are scrambling it together gives you a pretty fair indication of what they think the future holds for them. I mean, people don't have jobs. Public servants have not been paid. Bank accounts are frozen. And every single day on television, we're discussing this crisis. We have a major drought. We have 500,000 or 600,000 odd internally displaced people. We understand that the shortfall, $8.5 billion in foreign aid, including the security budget, that's 45% of our GDP. I mean, this is discussed on a daily basis on television. Who's going to fill that vacuum? So they understand that the country is going to face some strong headwinds.
And are there any thoughts about who's going to fill this vacuum? What is the conversation like on the ground with regards to in how this might be filled now that the 45% of it will be disappearing? Is it are there conversations between Taliban and China, or how will that work?
Listen, I think some Taliban are obviously sophisticated, but some are very naive, because for them to assume, even if for example, I'll give an example, the TAPI pipeline, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, will cost $6.5 billion. When it's finished, it'll generate a couple of $100 million in transit fees. So no one's going to be able to fill that vacuum. This is the issue, and this is something that we're very keen for people to discuss, and even for the Taliban to understand that if they're assuming that China will fill that vacuum, they're being very naive. So, I mean, the Russians will never invest anything, but the Chinese may give us some loans, but it's not going to fill that vacuum. It's not going to pay for hundreds of thousands of soldiers and policemen and public servants. It's not going to pay for the clinics, and it's not going to pay for the schools, and it's not going to pay for the roads. So this is the biggest challenge that Afghanistan faces today, is this economic crisis that's due to hit us very soon. Yeah,
and can you tell us a bit about the Taliban has noted that they're indifferent to international recognition. How are they going to manage this huge economic issue when they have such intolerance? They don't seem to mind about whether they're recognized internationally or not.
I think some of them recognize how, for example, the Haqqani network, the Haqqani family seems to be the sort of the most moderate. If you look at the three wings, the three deputies, Mullah Yaqub and Mullah Baradar, and then the Haqqanis seem to understand this. And I think they've been pushing for a sort of more open Afghanistan. But I think clearly most of them don't understand these challenges. The new chief of the central bank apparently brought together all the heads of the banks and said, listen, to be frank with you, I don't understand banking. What do you suggest? So this is the dilemma that we face, is that these people just don't quite get it. And Afghanistan in 1995 was very different to the Afghanistan of today. First and foremost, the population has gone from 21 million to almost 40 million. And the other thing is that Afghans were actually accustomed to, living a tough life and making ends meet. They had plots of land, they would grow their own vegetables. They just survived a civil war, a major, bloody civil war. But today Afghans are, I would use the word spoiled. I mean, they have high expectations, and they're used to a certain way of living. And it's going to become much more difficult for the Taliban to control people when they're starving to death. And I think they're going to face some real challenges. This is the concern that I have, is that they're going to become far more dictatorial than they were even in the mid 1990s, just to silence people.
Yeah, that's very concerning. I have a question here from Philip Schull. To what extent was the tactics or style of U.S. involvement a reason for the failure in its nation-build effort? NPR interviewed a 41-year-old Afghan woman yesterday, said the initial rejoicing in the ousting of the Taliban quickly soured when the anti-Soviet warlords the US installed began oppressing the local population so badly that many welcomed the Taliban's return.
I think there's a point to that. I think that, Afghanistan has changed for the better. People talk about the Afghanistan of the 70s of my parents and how wonderful it was. Literacy rate in Afghanistan in the 70s was 8%. Today, literacy rate amongst the young Afghans is like 75%. Nationally, it's more like 40. This has been an enormous opportunity for Afghans. I mean, someone described it as a stalemate for the US military, but for us, for most Afghans, it was precious, even with the warlords. But yes, the mistake was that that corruption was endemic. People, you look at even the democratic process. In 2014 and 2 years ago, there was fraud, and that's how people became president. And so for most Afghans became very cynical in terms of this new political order. They didn't support the Taliban. The Taliban's approval rating was never more than 10 or 15%, but ironically, the government's approval rating was also never above 20%. So we've had two bad options to choose from. And to a large extent, the Americans and the international community were seen as enablers for this corrupt, inept government and political order.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the new cabinet that's been formed, can you talk us through some of the headlines from the cabinet that the Taliban came up with?
Well, I mean, obviously, this has been a tug of war, a sort of intra-Taliban tug of war that we've, obviously been hearing about. They're very secretive. Nonetheless, it was obvious that there's been this competition as to who would prevail. I think it's a win for Pakistan. I think that you can see that some of the Kandahari strongmen, including Mullah Brother, have been either sidelined or have been demoted, or at least don't have prominent positions. It's obviously very Pashtun. Of the 33 members, only 2 are Tajiks and 1 is Uzbek. The rest are all Pashtuns. From Greater Kandahar, there are about 15. My assumption was that before this, that there would be more. The leader himself is one of Mullah Omar's allies, or one of the founders of the Taliban. He's seen by people who know him as fairly moderate, which is not a bad thing necessarily. The Haqqanis have some of the key positions, including the foreign minister, who seems to be close to them. And he obviously has the interior ministry, which is very important. I think this is sort of a victory for Pakistan. I think some of the anti-Pakistan figures, people who like Zakir and Saad Ibrahim, who were seen as sort of perhaps a bit closer to Iran, have been sidelined. But again, a lot of people are assuming that we will see some changes. I mean, they had to announce something quickly, because again, there was this vacuum, and no one was certain as to who was running the country. So I think the first step was to bring these people on, and then perhaps bring strong deputy ministers, or maybe change the ministers, or bring some other people to give the impression that it's a more inclusive government.
And just a final question then, before I turn it over to Anya Manuel and Philip Zelikow. How is this all affecting your work? Like, how are you thinking about, how's MOBY going to work? How are you going to, you're known as an entrepreneur, how are you going to grow in such uncertain circumstances?
We don't know. I mean, I wish I knew. We don't know. Yeah. We have to wait for the government. We have to wait for the new media laws. We have to wait for the directives that will come our way. We have to. We don't have an understanding of how the judiciary will work and how the prosecution will work. How tolerant will they be of the state being criticized? I mean, they do represent God. I mean, it may be difficult for us to challenge them, but what's important for us is that we have to be prepared to continue our work from outside of Afghanistan if we need to.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it seems reading up on your group that you're well prepared to do that, and there's such a wonderful and talented Afghan diaspora that will be able to help with that. Saad Mohseni, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning. Best wishes to you and of course everyone in Afghanistan. Thanks for all you've done and for championing the gender rights there and all your work. We look forward to engaging you again. Thanks.
Thank you.